military tactician, and a Wallachian and a Romanian patriot. There's lots of different ways that he's looked at from different sources. So those are accounts of Dracula shortly after his reign and shortly after his death. But what about the connection between Vlad Rakul and Count Dracula in fiction? In spite of all the things we know about Vlad Rakul, he's still an enigma. There's a lot of mysteries about his life, and there's a lot of speculation about the exact nature of the connection between Vlad and Count Dracula of Bram Stoker's classic. Most assume that Stoker was inspired by accounts he had read or heard about the 15th century Wallachian ruler, and he made a conscious decision to base the character of Count Dracula on the historical person. But this assumption is actually highly speculative. It's not all that clear. It's not as if in the foreword to Bram Stoker's Dracula, he says explicitly that it's based on the Wallachian ruler. All we know for certain is that Stoker borrowed the name Dracula and a few scraps of information about Wallachian history from William Wilkinson's An Account of Wallachia and Moldova in 1820. And this information about the evolution of the Dracula myth, if you want to read more about it, there's an article by Elizabeth Miller called Dracula, The History of Myth and the Mist of History that goes into this in a lot more detail. Well, the basis of the argument that Count Dracula and Vlad Rakul are the same person usually lies in one of two areas. The first is the information Bram Stoker learned from his relationship with Hungarian historian Arminius Vambéry. The second is whether the history Stoker provides for the Count suggests a detailed knowledge of Vlad. The assumption is that Vambéry filled Stoker's head with images of the deeds of Vlad Rakul, and that Stoker was given information concerning the history of the Wallachian voivode that the Irish author then used to create Count Dracula. Donald Glut states in his book, True Vampires of History, it was upon this historical Dracula that Bram Stoker based his novel of the notorious vampire Count. Stoker cited in his novel a certain Arminius, who is actually Arminius Vambéry of Budapest, who supplied him with such information concerning the Dracula who was referred to as the Impaler. Stoker incorporated what he learned of the historical Dracula in telling the origins of his romanticized character. This speculation was then popularized by the historians Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally. These are perhaps the best historians of the Dracula mythos to date, and they get into the area of speculation and state that it is the emphasis on the evil Dracula that fired the poetic imagination of the English horror story writer Bram Stoker through his contact with the Hungarian scholar Professor Arminius Vambéry. So they say that it's interesting to note that in all the regions of Romania, most of the genuine authenticated vampire cases were reported from Transylvania, particularly northern Transylvania, the scene of Stoker's Gothic plot, which stories Vambéry undoubtedly described in detail in the course of conversations with Bram Stoker. These speculations and these assumptions are reasonable, but there's a few facts to consider. First, there's no note of correspondence between Vambéry and Stoker. Stoker's personal notes concerning Dracula contain no mention of Arminius Vambéry as the source of his information. The two men did dine together following a theater production one time, and while writing Dracula, Stoker took meticulous notes, even going so far as to copy train schedules for accuracy. But in his known sources and his working papers, he doesn't mention Vambéry. All the historical information used by Stoker can be accounted for without the use of conversations between him and Vambéry. The other information used by him can be found in the work Transylvanian Superstitions. Stoker learned from the writer Emily Gerard, as well as a few other sources about Transylvanian superstitions and knowledge about vampires, that ultimately led to the setting for Dracula to be in Transylvania. Also, another point to consider is that in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Count Dracula is never referred to as Vlad, which is an interesting omission. And the process of impalement is also never brought up, save for use against the vampire. And in vampire lore, this was something that was understood as a way to kill a vampire and had nothing to do with Vlad's use of impalement. It came from folklore rather than history. If Stoker really wanted to base Count Dracula on Vlad Rakul, wouldn't he have worked these details in somehow? So, historians like Michael Vorsinos think that the vampire count and the Wallachian prince are not one and the same. They're two distinct figures. So what Stoker was trying to do was to create a fictional character, almost whole cloth, not to flesh out an existing villain. In Bram Stoker's working notes, he talks a lot about and he emphasizes the devil. The word is written in all capital letters. And we can find a lot of accounts in the Bible that can perhaps explain Count Dracula better than Vlad Rakul. The biblical story of Revelations, in this account, the dragon is associated with the devil. And it goes like this. Then another sign appeared in the sky. It was a huge red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its head were 10 diadems. Michael and his angels battled against the dragon. The huge dragon, the ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan. In Eastern Europe, and especially Romania, the symbol of the dragon is not associated with Satan in the same way, however. The dragon signifies unyielding strength in battle and was in no way associated with Satan. And continuing this idea that Dracula, or the dragon, is associated with the perversion of Christian traditions, which is perhaps what Bram Stoker was going for, is that vampires attain eternal life outside of the sacraments of the church while retaining their physical being. Normally in the Christian tradition, eternal life is associated with the spiritual resurrection, not the corporeal. Furthermore, the association of blood and eternal life is a theme that perverts the Eucharist. So it's perhaps more plausible that Stoker found the name Dracula and associated it with a legend of sorcery taught by the devil himself, and blended his little historical knowledge of Vlad Rakul to bolster the novel's realism. And then he added to this the vampire folklore and early vampire fiction that had come out before him to create a monster that was a parody of Christ.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
And one last thing I'll mention is that I'll expound on the fact that Vlad Rakul is looked upon somewhat favorably in his homeland in Romania, and sort of the end stop here of how he's considered historically. For many Romanians, they think it's something of an affront or insult that Vlad Rakul could be the inspiration for Count Dracula. They would think that the vampire connection has been deliberately emphasized in the West to undermine a figure who, to many Romanians, is something of a national hero. One Romanian historian, Alexandru Dudu, stated that in 1897, Vlad Tepes was transformed into a vampire in the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, a late reflection of the slanders concocted to destroy him centuries earlier. Now, it's very unlikely that Stoker sat down and intentionally based Dracula on Vlad Rakul in order to discredit Romanian history. In an interesting way, this goes back to a 400-year-old battle on the depiction of Vlad Rakul, where Saxon merchants talk about him as a bloodthirsty tyrant that make it plausible he could be the basis for Count Dracula, versus Romanian folk narratives that paint a very different picture. That Vlad is a supporter of the peasants against the treacherous boyars, who upholds the law and order in lawless times, and a valiant defender of his small principality against the Ottomans, and a fighter for Romanian independence. And especially in the 19th century, writers looked at Vlad as a symbol of independence and nationhood, as Romania was trying to assert itself and gain its own independence. So Vlad is presented as one of Romania's first great national heroes, fighting against the Turks, the boyars, and legions of evil. The late 19th century poet Mihai Eminescu, in his historical ballad The Third Letter, called on the Impaler to come once again and save his country. All right, so there you go. So in summation, I would say that Vlad Rakul, there is good reason to believe that he was bloodthirsty, but the idea that he was doing it out of pure psychosis seems to be more propaganda than historical fact. He might have just been using extreme methods to fight a much larger enemy. The idea that he's the basis for Count Dracula, there are probably aspects of him that do filter down into the vampire, but it doesn't seem to be a slam dunk that he is the basis. It seems more likely that Bram Stoker used his imagination and his excellent storytelling ability to create a mostly original character. So that's my take on the issue. Well, Marlene, thank you so much for the question, and I always welcome questions from the audience. And if I can, I'll do my best to answer them.
All right. Well, that wraps up our exploration of the past for this episode. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Baron Fraza, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to teespring.com/stores/history-unplugged. That's teespring.com/stores/history-unplugged. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.